famous British novelist, John Lancaster, once said, "It is strange and striking that the climate change activists have not committed any acts of terrorism. After all, terrorism is for the individual, by far, the modern world's most effective form of political action." And I would like today to take some time to explore the relationship between terrorism, direct action, and the climate change movement. First, I think it's important that we contextualize the magnitude of the crisis that we face today. In a report by the United Nations Council on Climate Change, they said that it is now or never to massively slash global carbon emissions if we don't want to face extinction. That was in April of last year, and since then, nothing has happened. In fact, we're seeing increased deaths, displacement, severity of climate disasters, and we are far past the point of prevention of the oncoming climate disaster, and now we're merely talking about mitigation. And yet those in power turn a blind eye. In fact, according to the UN's own reports, they're not just turning a blind eye. High-emitting governments and corporations are in fact adding fuel to the fire. And so, in the face of such an existential crisis, I think it's important that we understand the language that some of these institutions have leveled against the people that disapprove of their actions. It's time we talk about terrorism. The definition of terrorism, very broadly, is the use of intentional violence and fear to achieve political or ideological aims. Sounds pretty simple, right? But the reality is, as the case Western Reserve Journalism International Law tells us, that label is often manipulated for political gain because one man's terrorist can be another man's freedom fighter. One only has to look at how the United States designated Nelson Mandela as a terrorist until 2008, and yet Henry Kissinger, the architect behind the Cambodian genocide, is still breathing the free man's air. And in no other place is this demonstrated as perfectly as when the Brennan Center for Justice reports that for decades, the FBI designated eco-terrorism, which has never claimed a single American life, as a bigger threat than white supremacy. It is clear that the United States holds some forms of violence as more threatening than the others. How could this be the case? It's important to understand that the United States essentially acts as a client state for fossil fuel industries. As the New York Times tells us in April of this year, US taxpayers spent $5.9 trillion propping up the fossil fuel industry. But it's not just politicians that are paying the fossil fuel industry. It also is reciprocal. Because as Statistica tells us, between the years of 1990 and 2022, the fossil fuel industry collectively spent $75.9 million lobbying and buying politicians. And what do they get for this massive purchase? They get a government that intentionally props up protests of climate change that they know are ineffective. As the famous author Charles Cobb of the book, "This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed," states, oppressive governments intentionally prop up nonviolent protests as a counter to violent protests because they're easier to ignore. One only has to look at how the US government has co-opted, whitewashed, and elevated the legacy of Martin Luther King in contrast to how they demonized the legacy of Malcolm X, despite the two being in almost all regards in alignment. As The Guardian writes, Martin Luther King, who white liberals look to today as a freedom fighter, would have decried these very same people who are far more concerned about how freedom fighters look towards even the slightest bit of violence than the oppressive and dangerous institutions that necessitate freedom fighters in the first place. When climate activists throw soup at the glass coverings of famous paintings or string human chains across highways, we spend weeks talking about the inconvenience of these protests. And yet, when the Shell Corporation, as exposed by Global Citizen in 2019, pay soldiers to kill Nigerian climate activists, the world is silent. And so it is time to turn to direct action. Because as the Sussex University professor Benjamin Sovacool explains, property damage is an effective tool for violent protest. Coordinated, sustained movements that destroy property tend to be more effective. A study done collecting data from the 1980s showed that American activists that were more willing to use property damage as a tool were able to reach their goals quicker than those who were not. And as legendary ecological professor and activist Andres Mall writes, the climate change movement needs to embrace property damage. And we have tons of examples in which property damage has actually been effective in achieving material change. One only has to look towards the Boston Tea Party or the ANC's destruction of South African farms in order to end apartheid. Of course, this is not an acceptance of the harm of innocent civilians. The preservation of innocent lives is tantamount in the pursuit of justice. But it is time that we face the existential crisis that we are currently staring down the barrel of. We have to reciprocate the violence that is done to us every single day. The violence of increasing carbon and fossil fuel emissions, the violence of destroying natural habitats, and the violence of the inaction or malicious action of states and organizations and corporations that would rather make a few more bucks than save the world. Don't look to what the oppressor says in order to understand what's actually effective at stopping people from harming the world. Look to what the oppressor does to stop people from engaging in proactive justice. They have wholeheartedly embraced violence. How are we going to defend ourselves? Thank you. Woo! Woo!